Down to business.
When he drinks, he thinks.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the #1 liquid-fueled, liquid lubricated show on the interwebs. This is the Whiskey Musings Broadcast, and hey, I just got to do a little bit of a shout to a couple people out on Rumble. If you guys really want to do the twist to my intro music, go for it, okay? Go for it. All right. So, first of all, yes, I am feeling better. However, I do have this annoying cough. So, as you just saw, I will try and keep it to a minimum, but don't be surprised if I take a couple breaks and start coughing occasionally. All right. Okay. So I've had a couple things. They changed a little bit in my programs, some of the things that I use in order to monitor the chats, and I didn't realize it, but I wanted to take a look. Wanted to see how and seems to be functioning now, but if I all of a sudden lose it halfway through the show, then that is what it is. All right. Tonight I am drinking my second favorite. By second favorite, I mean number 1.5 out of 1.5 from the other one. But obviously, this is the Four Roses. This is the small batch versus the single barrel. And realistically, I mean, I can taste a tiny bit of a difference between the two, but to be completely honest, I don't really care one way or the other on this. I like both. I like both of them. And that's what I'm drinking. So I'm actually drinking it straight. You want yet again with the little whiskey stones in there. I don't know if you can see them. They're kind of a little, there you go. A little bit of one. You can just kind of see them in there. Anyway, great stuff. Good stuff. All right. Gotta love it. Gotta love it. All right. So before I get going on everything, I just want to say, I was on Twitter. In case you haven't noticed, I do that a lot. And the reason why I do is because I love irking the heck out of the liberals that are over there. Okay. So anyway, a couple of topics came up during my Twitter conversations over the last couple of days. And, realistically, they are common talking points from the left, but they're actually myths. And I also recall that I did a broadcast, I don't know, probably about a year ago. This thing is 108. I'm on 180 episodes starting tonight. I mean, tonight's 180. So anyway, I don't remember how far back, but I did make a mention that I would be handling or discussing the whole idea of the separation of church and state. And so in conjunction with the conversations that I was having, and by conversations, I mean leftist liberal nutbags trying to prove to me that they know stuff, two things came apparent. One is that, yes, there is a problem with the whole idea of separation of church and state. And secondly, there's this myth running around, for lack of a better term, or a misunderstanding about the application of federal funding across the states, and that the red states are being subsidized by the blue states. And actually, to be honest with you, vice versa. I mean, the Republicans have made that claim on multiple occasions as well, that the, red states that, that they were subsidizing the blue states. So I've got some information on both of those tonight. And so if you'll indulge me, this isn't my typical thing, but I'm going to take off my talk about, current events and stupid libtards for a little bit and put on my instructor hat and historian hat and give you guys a look into history in the past when it comes to the Constitution and the meaning of the whole, what they call the Establishment Clause. So you may want to go, if you have it. If not, grab a copy, whatever copy you have, but you may want to go and grab a Constitution, because we're going to look into this. And I'm going to be kind of referring to a couple things that are in here during the course of the night. So, sorry, geez, horrible stuff. All right. So let me go ahead and get my tonight's affiliate sponsor, or whatever you want to call them, out of the way here. I'm going to make sure which one I'm doing. I keep forgetting these. All right. Let's talk about True Grit Roots Network. True Grit Roots Network, TGRN, champions independent artists while paying respect to the pioneers who shaped modern roots music, featuring outlaw country, blues, and rock with a unique twist of urban that is carefully selected and purposely put together. We are the radio highway that connects the back roads, highways, and city streets to your favorite dance hall, roadhouse, and juke joint. TGRN provides original exclusive programming and interviews that are produced and hosted by our own team of DJs, hosts, and personalities. Find us on the web at tgrn.net to download our app in the App Store and from Google Play. Alternatively, you can find us in the Live 365 catalog of internet digital radio stations and through the Live 365 app as well. You can also play our station on your Amazon Alexa by saying, play True Grit Roots Network from Live 365. Be sure to use the word from in the command, play True Grit Roots Network from Live 365. Live 365 is also on Roku. And TGRN wants to welcome our sponsor, American Badass Whiskey from Garage Oil Spirits. American Badass Whiskey is a high-octane, extra-fine blend of American whiskey made for every hardworking man and woman that proudly puts in a solid day's work every day. Check out this new award-winning Texas whiskey at garageoilspirits.com. That website, once again, is garageoilspirits.com. Breaking boundaries for authentic roots radio, True Grit Roots Network, tgrn.net, Austin, Texas. And of course, just for the, in the interest of full disclosure, I am a part owner and, in TGRN with my partner. Okay. So let's talk about this, myth that's about the wall of separation that especially the left likes to use because they love to try and, perpetuate the idea that America is not a Christian founded or religious based country, that we are not supposed to be, surrounding religion. And in fact, religion is not supposed to be in anything when it comes to government. So things like, for an example, taking down 10 commandments on government property, getting rid of statues and things that are reminiscent of, God and crosses, Bible verses, all of these things. And they want to, they've done a very good job, actually, of getting rid of all of these things. Well, tonight I'm going to present to you some information that will refute all of that. That's going to demonstrate that we have, we've kind of misinterpreted the idea of the wall of separation between them. Okay? Now, Let's start off with reading the First Amendment to the Constitution. So you may want to grab your Constitution copy. And I only want to read the first couple lines, to be honest. And the reason being is because we have to frame this in the idea with the First Amendment and the way that it is written. So Amendment 1 on the Constitution states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's the entire First Amendment, okay? Now, the two parts that we're going to discuss tonight are, in particular, the very first line, which is, or the very first part of the very first line, I should say, which is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay? Now, first of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that the word religion, honestly, only shows up a couple of times, and the word God actually doesn't show up at all within the Constitution itself. In fact, it's the preamble to the Declaration of Independence that states about the Creator. Okay. There is one other place where they, inside the Constitution, where they do talk about a deity, a godlike being, and that has to deal with the oath of office. And it's sort of an obscure reference, but realistically, none of that actually matters. So let me take you back in history, and let's start with this idea of what role did religion have in the framers building the Constitution. So, and I'm going to kind of gloss over a little bit, a few things, but I really need you to understand. First of all, the people that came over here who wanted to create this new world, they were primarily being persecuted over in England. They were mostly Protestant, some Baptists, some Quakers, some Methodists, but they were mostly, if not all, Christian religions. There were no Muslims, there were no Buddhists. There wasn't anybody coming over here who had other religious backgrounds that we know of. Okay. But the main thing that you need to understand is that the whole purpose of them coming here was to get away from the whole Church of England and to be able to practice their religious beliefs in security, in safety. They didn't want to be a part of the Church of England. And speaking of the Church of England, back then, most countries, most civilized nations actually had a tie between the church and it's typically the monarch or the dictator. There was, in France, the cardinal, as an example, for throughout most of France's history, actually ruled the country instead of necessarily the king. Even though they were technically two people, you had the king and then you had the cardinal over the religious aspect of the country. And the cardinal actually, in some cases, took over and took power. There are obviously the Church of England, which was brought together by the monarch, the king. And so it basically was a common practice to have a state sponsored, by state I mean dictator or leader, king, whatever, monarchy, sponsored religion. And the pilgrims that came over here, they wanted to do was practice their religion without interference from the monarchy, which is part of the reason. Again, that was their primary reason for the most part for coming to the New World. So they get over here and they start building their, all of their the states, all of the little colonies, and then they go through the entire Revolutionary War. Now, I've made the case, and you can easily see, that the first 10 amendments that are a part of the Constitution are a direct reflection of the atrocities, many of the atrocities, that the Pilgrims endured during the time prior to and during the Revolutionary War. Things like housing army soldiers in the houses and, that kind of stuff without the owner's permission. That was common practice for the British Army to come over and just take over civilian residences and kick the families out. Things like warrantless searches and seizures. That was done by the British Army at the behest of the king. The idea of the Second Amendment in the right to keep and bear arms. That was done because of the fact that the British Army would go through and take not only the guns, but they would also take ammunition as well. And they would confiscate all of those things. They would also, the British Army went and confiscated things like papers and the press. So we got the freedom of the press off of that. And of course, the whole idea of the subjugation of the colonies to have them come back into the religious fold of the Church of England was another big fear that the colonists had. So when they came through and started to create this country, and keep in mind the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution as we know it today, is actually the second document that was created. The first one was the Articles of Confederation, which failed miserably. And so that prompted the founding fathers to all get together in the Convention of States to create a more superior document. And they went through a lot of discourse back and forth. I've pointed out the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers. These are our written history to understand the communications that were going on between the different factions of those that supported the Constitution and those that didn't. Okay. Now, the thing about it is that, again, the idea here was to create a government that was beholden to the people, meaning that the people themselves were higher than the government, and that the government was essentially subjugated to the people. Also, keep in mind that the government was supposed to be very limited in power and scope, especially from the idea of having a government seat that was far away, like they had experienced during the Revolutionary period. So, what they ended up doing is they wrote out the Constitution of the United States. And what they did is they came up with a few ideas. One was a representative government, which the idea there was to make sure that the people had power. Now, I was in the process of kind of researching this. I ran across a couple of things that explained how they came up with the idea of the split house between the House of Representatives, or a split Congress between the House of Representatives and the Senate in terms of the idea as to where that came from and who advocated that. But one of the things that is kind of interesting, which I think a lot of people don't seem to understand, is that during the time that the Constitution of the United States was actually being written, Thomas Jefferson was our envoy and emissary over in France. And so he was not physically here during the writing of the Constitution. Now, to give you a little insight into Thomas Jefferson himself, okay, he was a pious man, and by pious I mean he was a religious man. Okay, but in terms of religion and his thoughts on religion, is he actually believed that religion and its practicing thereof was something that was of a very personal nature. And so he, along with James Madison, believed that government itself should not be involved with religion. Now, the funny thing about that is that they didn't actually, notice what I said there, that government should not be involved in religion. But they never classified how religion should play within the role of government. And this is a very crucial and key point here in terms of understanding the thought processes behind this entire thing. Okay. Now, so fast forward a little bit, we've got, they went through and did a lot of different things. They pulled from a lot of different documents, some of the state documents, like, so the Virginia, there was a Virginia document that was written for the state of Virginia that Thomas Jefferson actually was involved in. There was one in particular also for, I believe it's the state of New Jersey now, but that was another one that they essentially tried to meld together into this whole idea of the Constitution and how these things were put together. And they looked through a lot of different documents, but they also referenced the Holy Bible as well. Okay. Now, after they did the Constitution didn't originally have the Bill of Rights. It was not until a couple years later down the road that they decided that they needed to have a Bill of Rights. And the reason being is because a lot of people were concerned that there wasn't anything that was defined in the original text of the Constitution that defined the rights of the people. In fact, and I'm trying to get there to get the right date here. Let's see. So the first 10 amendments were actually ratified, and by ratified, they went through the convention and everything else, and all of the states at the time went ahead and said, yeah, this is a good thing. It was ratified on December 15th, 1791, and essentially became known as the Bill of Rights. Okay. Now this Bill of Rights was designed to take, it was essentially designed to take the idea of government and say, you know what, here's the guardrails within which you guys cannot do things. Okay. So contrary to popular belief today, because we have a lack of education, the Constitution by itself does not grant people rights. The Constitution, the way that it was originally framed and originally designed, was to take and lock in government and make it very, very small and limited. So every time you read the Bill of Rights, one of the challenges is that a lot of people think they're like, oh, the Second Amendment gives people the right to do X, in this case, keep and bear arms. No, it doesn't give us the right to keep and bear arms. What it does have is it tells the government, you cannot take away the people's right to keep and bear arms. And it's all a matter of how you look at and place the Constitution on which side of the conversation in order to understand where everything is coming from. Okay. Now, in the First Amendment, okay, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion, meaning that Congress cannot make a law that forces a particular religion or a state-sponsored religion upon the people. And then, of course, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, meaning that, well, it also can't stop people from exercising their religion. Okay. And so when you look at it in that frame of reference, all right, it basically means that Congress by itself cannot block you in any way, whether it comes from a government state-sponsored religion versus practicing your own religion in the way that you see fit. Okay. And I always use the term when it comes to people who talk about the wall of separation, I always use the term that the First Amendment is freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. So it was already accepted when you look at the how important it was to keep religion out of the hands of the government, meaning that the government couldn't touch people's religion, to understand the importance of religion to these people. Okay. So that's the first point. All right. When you talk about the wall of separation, you have to understand that religion was very important to these people. And they didn't even consider the idea, regardless of which denomination they actually were, they did not consider the idea that God did not exist. Okay. Everything that they assumed is that you have the natural law and then you have civil law underneath it, and natural law supersedes. And one of the things that has natural law is the right to speak freely, the right to bear arms, the right to, congregate and assemble. And that's where a lot of these Bill of Rights came from, is because they assumed that everybody would just naturally understand that there was natural law and civil law below that. Okay. Now, we need to take a look at Thomas Jefferson, because the term separation of church and state is actually based off of a metaphor that was used in Thomas Jefferson's letter that he wrote while he was president of the United States as our third president. Now, during that time, the president and the presidential election as the third president was very contentious. And the opposite side, you had, Thomas Jefferson, and I believe it was John Adams was the other contender at the time. And just like today's politics, Thomas Jefferson got literally raked over the coals when it came to his positions on religion. And so when he got his, when he actually won and was put into office, there was a small sect of Baptists out of, they called themselves, now wait a minute, I got to get this right. I got to find this thing. Okay. Yeah, it was John Adams. Sorry. It was John Adams and who was the opponent to Jefferson. The Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut. And they wrote on a letter to, they wrote a letter to Jefferson. And the reason being is because during the election, John Adams painted Jefferson as this, atheist, a guy that wanted to get rid of religion, so on and so forth. And he ended up to where they were concerned. And so they sent a letter to Thomas Jefferson, first of all, congratulating him on winning the presidency, but also to clarify his position on the role of government in religious matters. And so what Thomas Jefferson sent back was a response that basically stated in it, there is a wall of separation between the church and the state. Now, the thing about that is that Jefferson didn't actually qualify what that really meant. He just basically used it as a metaphor to essentially affirm the fact that the First Amendment stated that the Congress can't pass a law regarding the establishment of religion, and that they were free to do whatever it was that they wanted to do. And this is important context because, again, the situation was such that Thomas Jefferson was being smeared as being a person who was against religious persecution, against religious practice. And one other thing that also was occurring at the same time was the French Revolution. Okay. So the French Revolution, there were a lot of people over there that during that time period over in France, there was a lot of desecration of religious sanctuaries and symbols and things of that nature over during the Revolution that was a cause for concern with a lot of people in the colonies, because Jefferson actually was reported to support the French Revolution. And so that was essentially the trigger that made it so that John Adams could push the idea that Jefferson was against religion. And this is where all of this comes about. Now, so again, framing the idea that Jefferson was not against religion. He and Madison, though, were of like mind in the idea of believing that government needs to stay out of religious affairs. But they never, ever, ever talked about whether or not religion could penetrate into government. Because again, they always felt, and John Adams actually made a very famous quote where he's talking about the Constitution being the government only of a moral and religious people. Oh, Mrs. Whiskey, she just stopped in to say hi. Okay, so he made the quote of the Constitution being the government only for a moral and religious people. Okay. So ultimately, we need to understand that the Constitution itself is a document that was created by a religious group of people, and that they did not believe that government should control religion. But that also didn't mean that they were of the mindset of taking out religion completely from civil government. Okay. So this is the challenge here, though, is the fact that Jefferson used the words of a wall of separation. And it wasn't actually till about 140 years later that a case came in front of the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court decided to grab onto that particular phrase out of that particular letter and put it up in front of everybody and say basically that church and state must be separated. And there's been 3 or 4 others that have all used that, 3 or 4 other cases that have all used that initial precedent that have divided it, and have stated that the wall is there. But the one thing that they also don't understand is how porous actually is that wall. Is that wall just a impenetrable set of brick like it's currently thought of? Or is it more of a malleable kind of thing? Now, James Madison, as much as he and Thomas Jefferson agreed that government should not be part of religion, or shouldn't be in control of religion, James Madison actually thought of it not so much as a wall, but more of a defining line. And it was a little more in the gray area from him, in terms of the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, again, we have to look at the phrasing. The phrasing is that Congress can't establish a state religion, but also can't stop the free exercise of religion. And that would indicate to me that religion itself is not completely, like it's thought of today, not completely separated from government, but that government doesn't have the power to influence or get involved in religion. Okay. But that religion can certainly, without any reason, get involved in government. And in fact, this is even further emphasized if we go back to Thomas Jefferson in particular. Thomas Jefferson, while president, actually funded a lot of church-related projects from the government. He actually did some schools and things like that, which, of course, back then, a lot of the schools were run by religious organizations. They didn't necessarily have a separate college system, although James Madison did set up a separate university. And so, again, the thing about it is, regardless of what the left talks about, the idea was that government can't control or can't influence religion, but that there is absolutely no mention or understanding in any case that the religion can't permeate into the government, because the wall of separation in particular was a metaphor that was used in order to, again, focus mostly on government-sponsored religion and not religion penetrating government. Because you also have to understand that in order to have a civil government and in order for laws to actually work, you have to have a moral standing. You have to have an understanding of morals. And as far as that goes, I mean, in order to be able to look at civil government and laws and rules and regulations, you have to have an understanding that there is something greater than you and that you have a moral obligation to succumb to those rules, which, if you look in the Bible, that is clearly what is talked about with Jesus. Jesus talks about God's law, and then he also talks about the law of man and how you're supposed to submit yourself to the law of man as long as it doesn't cross God's law, because God's law supersedes, which again, in the eyes of the Pilgrims, God's law supersedes civil law. But that doesn't mean that you can be essentially ignore civil law if it doesn't cross God's law, if you follow what I mean. Okay. All right. So realistically, the whole idea of the wall of separation actually doesn't necessarily exist. It is a phrase that has been completely taken out of context by a letter to a constituency during Thomas Jefferson's presidency that was specific to the Baptists issuing concern, given the political climate and the climate going on over in another country, France, as to whether or not the American government was going to do something in order to attack religion here in the U.S. due to the French Revolution. Hopefully all of that makes sense. All right. Okay. So I've put a bunch of articles and things in the show notes. You can go and pull these. The first one is, and honestly, that kind of breaks it down a little bit more than what I've done here, is, and let me go ahead and show you, is a Heritage Foundation piece that kind of breaks down a lot of what I discussed in terms of the actual First Amendment, in particular, focusing on the establishment of and free practice thereof, dealing with religion. So once again, keep in mind, I mean, this was not, the idea was, when you take it in terms of the context of the situation and the context of the period, which you have to when you're looking at some of these writings in terms of being able to understand the complete meaning of what's going on in the context, it was essentially hemming in the government from doing anything towards with respect to religion. Okay. And that pretty much is basically where that goes. But this is the major piece. I have a couple of other things. I actually have the texts of the letters between Thomas Jefferson in the show notes, and this one here in particular, this is the actual text, which a lot of people don't actually read and reference, but this is the text from the Baptist to Thomas Jefferson, and it gives us the idea and understanding of how and why Thomas Jefferson responded the way that he did. I also have included a link that goes to the actual drafts that Thomas Jefferson did, not the final. Well, it does include the final version of the letter, but it includes, and let me go ahead and get this up here. Oh, where is it? Oh, come on. I know it's in here somewhere. Oh, I must have missed it. Anyway, it includes the text, the text as it was sent, but it also includes, and maybe I didn't pull it up, but it also includes the lineouts, the text that he actually crossed out before he wrote the final letter. Because contrary to popular belief, they did not have whiteout back then. So they couldn't just like, let's just white this out and write over it. Didn't work that way. So anyway, yeah. So realistically, if you go and you start to analyze, which again, a lot of people, especially nowadays, don't do. If you go and analyze a lot of what was written and base it off of the context of the period, as well as the accompanying information, you can get a pretty clear picture in terms of what the idea was for our government, our civil government, and the way that it was set up. All right. Let me go ahead and let's go back here. And let me go ahead and just in between these two, let me just do this. Where is it? Here we go. Let's go ahead and do the pet of the week.
Please check your mailbox. A new message has arrived.
All right. And tonight's pet of the week comes from Dan Patrick. Not quite sure if, they sent me the email. This is what they said. They're Dan Patrick. That's what they said. So let me go ahead and move over to that screen. We'll get rid of this. And let me go ahead and bring up. This is not so much of a pet. I mean, going to be honest with you, I don't necessarily consider this a pet because it actually is a wild animal. not a like keep in the house sort of pet. But hey, whatever works. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a little bit. And yes, I did say it's not little, but lil, L-I-L, little bit. And a little bit is a Florida gecko. Now, little bit comes out to visit when people are sitting on the patio and are sitting around listening to either the Mark K Show or this program, the Whiskey Musings Broadcast. He enjoys the information being presented. I think he would have enjoyed tonight's presentation for sure. But he listens, he enjoys listening to the information presented. And of course, the stimulating conversations that are prompted by the subject matter presented by Mark K and yours truly. So apparently he sits there and listens to the conversation while the humans are sitting on the patio and they're talking all over the place. After listening to the show, apparently a little bit, goes back to his colony of cohorts to spread the conservative message to the gecko community. And that is tonight's pet of the week. Do me a favor, if you would like me to feature your pet or the program, send me an email to fans, F-A-N-S, that's Foxtrot Alpha November Sierra, phonetically spelled, at whiskeymusings.online. That's fans, F-A-N-S, at whiskeymusings.online. Link is in the description of the video. You can go ahead and go to Rumble, or if you have to, go to YouTube and get it from the link in the description. But yeah, so, I got to tell you a little bit, man, more power to you, buddy. You're like hanging out with the right place at the right place to learn and get a plethora of information with regards to conservatism. And of course, he's taking it back to his gecko community. That's what I like. He's going back and trying to convert all those liberal geckos that are running around in his colony of cohorts. Anyway, so that is Little Bit's story. And thank you to Dan Patrick for submitting a little bit for the pet of the week. Also keep in mind, I need to have a question for whiskey for Saturday. Submit it to the same email, please. fans@whiskeymusings.online. I need a question. So, yeah. So there we go. So that was the gecko. Little Bit. The Florida gecko. We actually don't have geckos up here. We actually have, a more of a, I think they call it a skink. It's a similar thing to a gecko. I mean, in terms of looks and things like that, but they tend to, run a little smaller. And, up here where I'm at, they like a lot of wet places. So it's not like a dry, it's more of a wet type of thing. But anyway, he, the skinks around here though, can actually drop their tails. So if you get a hold of the skink's tail, it will actually drop it. I've had that happen before. It can then regrow and regenerate. So it's kind of interesting. But anyway, yeah, salamanders too. Yeah. But skinks and salamanders, those are the ones that are here. So anyway, all right. Okay. So let's move on to my next. Ooh, excuse me. Oh, goodness. Let's move on to my next topic that I want to debunk. So running through, if you again, this whole conversation spawned, actually, believe it or not, from the MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene point about doing a divorce, a national divorce, and what everybody, what a national divorce would actually look like. Now, I can tell you that as far as I'm concerned, I honestly don't think that a national divorce is really feasible. And the reason that I say that is because most people look at the country as either blue states versus red states, when in reality, what it actually is, it's more of a red state with blue cities in it. And I've said it before. I've said it on social media. I've said it even here on this program. Right now, we're actually setting up to more of a urban versus rural kind of scenario. Because if you look at the places where most of the civil unrest is, most of the crime is being committed, largely, or violent crime, I should say, you'll start to notice a pattern. In particular, it happens to be surrounding the urban centers and the suburban centers where the most populated people are being. Now, I've told you in the past, and I've advocated this before, and I've even shown it on multiple occasions, that what they call the left coast is actually not the states of Washington, Oregon, and California. It's actually the most populated places in those states that are causing the problem. The same thing with New York. New York is actually a situation where you have the city, New York City, that is the most liberal, but yet when you start to go into upstate New York and get closer to, say, the Canadian border, things start becoming a little more conservative. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the state itself is, not like what's classified as a purple state or a mixture between the blue and the red. Some of those states actually, are like that. New Mexico, for an example. But the big key here is that everybody keeps talking about, having this divorce. And there's a lot of nuances that are all a part of this that honestly, I don't think will ever actually happen. But the sentiment, for the most part, is dealing with the leftists and their wild ideas and social justice warrior stuff that makes absolutely no logical sense. Like the idea of, giving reparations for slavery when slavery was done and over with 200 years ago. Okay. And not a single person in the country alive today is actually going to be considered either a slave or a slave owner. Okay. It's the ideas like that make it so that the division in this country is getting to the point where, yeah, people actually want a divorce. They don't want to live next to who they consider lunatics. And it goes both ways. I mean, the leftists think that the right is lunatics. The right thinks that the left are lunatics. And we're just getting even deeper and deeper in terms of the divide. An example of this was the conversation that Scott Adams was having, in particular, about a poll that was taken and, dealing with African Americans, the black population, how many people think it's okay to say it's okay to be white. I mean, if you look at things nowadays, you're looking at stuff that, you're looking at stuff nowadays where, the black population is, and even some of the white white population, the white liberals are actually discriminating against whites. And they're doing it in the idea of equity. But in reality, all it is just a form of reverse racism, like Ibram X. Kendi likes to tout in his idea of, CRT and applications and things like that. Now, that being said, that sets up the idea of how in terms of the aspect of government funding, how would we necessarily break this stuff up? And one of the key components that has come out from the argument from the left is the idea that the left states, or the blue states, as they call them, are actually funding the red states, meaning that the blue states' taxes are actually being taken by the red states. And I found this kind of odd because of the fact that, okay, if you look at just the sheer number of, in terms of the sheer amount of taxes that are collected, generally speaking, and this is really a generalization, okay? Generally speaking, most of the states that have very large cities, like California, New York, Washington, Florida, and Texas, create a huge number of tax revenue. And so because of that, the idea there is people are thinking, well, California in particular, New York, a lot of Illinois, a lot of these places are considered, blue states. And so the blue states are actually funding the red states because they're putting more into the pot than what they're actually taking out. Okay. But that's a very simplistic view of a very complex situation. And so hopefully here tonight, I'm actually going to be able to kind of break this down a little bit and show you that it's not all that cut and dried. And the reason why I'm talking about this, honestly, is because of the fact that I got slammed on Twitter by some liberal arse who essentially was saying, heck yeah, let's divorce because, the red states will wither up and die. Like, So here's a couple of things, and that on this program that I try to find left-leaning outlets for my proof because, of course, I like the idea of making sure that we just turn the tables on the left using the left's own words. So therefore, let me show you this. Came from The Hill. Whoops. Okay. This is an opinion article that came from the finance section of The Hill. And The Hill is a left-leaning outlet. And, of course, the title, this is by Skip Estes. And, of course, the title says, no, blue states do not bail out red states. And he kind of goes into a breakdown of what's happening. And essentially what he says is, and let me go ahead and quote this here. Those arguing that blue states are the ones bailing out red states point to the federal balance of payment ratios, or the federal tax dollars collected compared to the federal money received on a state-by-state basis. The states with the lowest balance of payment ratios, collecting more federal taxes than they receive in federal funds, are, according to his analysis, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and New York. The states with the highest balance of payments, receiving more federal funds than they collect in federal taxes, are Kentucky, New Mexico, Mississippi, and West Virginia. Therefore, when you look at just that metric alone, okay, just that metric alone, this is where they get the idea that blue states are bailing out red states, okay? But here's the thing. Federal balance of payment ratios are not as indicative as pundits think that they are. So New Mexico, as an example, is often deemed as a blue state, and West Virginia had Democratic control of both the governor's mansion and both state legislative chambers as recently as 2014. The relationship between state policy and balance of payment ratios becomes even weaker, considering that North Dakota, New Hampshire, and Nebraska, so-called red states, all have balance of payment ratios less than 1. This means they receive less in federal funds than they collect in federal taxes, just like Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and New York. So here's the thing. There is a lot of nuanced information that goes into these things. For an example, you can have a state that has a lot of military bases within it that would seemingly get more federal funds than one that doesn't have any military installations in it. And that would skew the results. So you continue down in this article, and he says, in fact, 40 states have a balance of payment ratio that is higher than 1.0. Far from a dependency caused by state political leaning, it is typical for states to receive more in federal funds than they collect in federal taxes, an anomaly made possible only by, get this, rampant federal deficit spending. So in other words, Joe Biden is affecting this because of the fact that what he is doing is with rampant federal spending and all of those stimulus checks and everything else that he's been sending out, causes this whole idea of taxes being spent or collected from the federal government for states versus what they put into the pot. There'll be a larger disparaging difference. Okay. Now, the Hill is not the only one that talks about this. You also have to look at things like higher income per capita. So, for an example, the states with the highest personal income per capita are Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey. A lot of that, I think, comes from, working and living in New York. And I can tell you that if you go to New York, the cost of living is extremely higher in a lot of cases in comparison to other places, like, say, Arkansas, for an example. You also have a challenge here. You also have a challenge where it deals with who qualifies to get federal assistance, which is where a lot of this is coming from. A lot of the money that's received from the federal government goes toward federal assistance payments. And so everybody has the exact same limit in terms of qualification because it applies equally across all 50 states. But the cost of living in places like Hawaii versus someplace like Arkansas, for an example, throws a monkey wrench into the difference between the two. Okay. Now, the biggest programs, of course, are Medicaid Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, SSDI, which is Social Security Disability Insurance, and Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. All right. Each of these is means tested, meaning the recipients must earn below a certain income threshold in order to receive the federal assistance. Low-income states receive more federal money than higher-income states by design because of this means-tested federal poverty programs. As these programs expand and become more generous, the gap between the state balance of payment ratios will only increase as federal taxes and spending increase to pay for means-tested poverty assistance, which is basically what I just said. Okay. Now, here's an example. So that's from the Hill, and there's a lot more to this, so I highly encourage you to read this. But here's another article that comes from the Mises Institute, MISES Institute. And they basically say pretty much the same kind of a thing, which is essentially that the idea from a lot of people, like you can see here, Molly Knight on Twitter was saying red states get their money for roads and cops and schools from blue states. You cut off that gravy train and you got a third world country. And then Tim Wise says, has it ever occurred to you that if it wasn't for blue parts of those red states, the latter would be entirely broke? We subsidize y'all's country asses. You're welcome. Well, when this particular article went through, they created this, you can see this chart, and I'm going to enlarge it here in just a second. So they took this chart and they basically said, okay, let me get it a little larger for you here. All right. Ooh, that's a little too big. Let's back this up. All right. So what they did for this chart, okay, and it says at the top here, it says federal spending received for every dollar collected by state, meaning that the amount that they are using here is how much more is coming from the federal government versus what each state is actually sending. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you look at this list, okay, you have Mississippi, which is a red state. New Mexico is actually considered a purple state. You have West Virginia, which could play in the purple, blue kind of area, or possibly red, depending upon the year. Alabama is obviously red. Alaska is red. Maine is perfectly blue. Hawaii is blue. Montana's red. South Carolina is red. Vermont is blue. Kentucky is generally thought of as red. Arizona is thought of as purple. Virginia could be purple or blue, depending upon which way you go. Wyoming is red. Oklahoma is usually red. Idaho is red. New Hampshire is blue. Louisiana, I mean, again, going down this list, there is not a clear divide. There's not a clear divide between the blue states and the red states. And again, if you go off the idea that everybody who receives federal funding, and I mean, this continues all the way down the road. You have, Michigan, Oregon, Iowa, Indiana, North Carolina, North Dakota. They're all mixed in together. And to further illustrate this point, let me go ahead and show you this graphic. This graphic. So this takes a look at the GDP per capita versus its federal dependency score. Now, if it were true that the blue states were funding the red states, you would see a clear division in this graph. You would see a clear defining line between the blue dots, which represent the blue states, and the red dots, which represent the red states. But there's no clear defining line here. They're all kind of grouped in together. So the whole idea that the blue states are actually funding the red states is a myth. It's a misnomer. It is completely false. And frankly, I get a little irritated when people actually use it because they don't. Now, there's one other aspect to this entire thing that people need to understand as well. They did an analysis. There was and unfortunately, I don't have the article or the resource, but you can find it. I mean, you can find it on the internet. They did an analysis at one point. And they found that the majority of blue states versus the majority of red states, the majority of blue states are actually running very similarly to the way our federal government does, which is deficit spending. So in that particular case, the governments of blue states, such as California, which has registered a whopping $7 trillion deficit under Gavin Newsom, they are actually running behind. So the taxes that are being collected today and tomorrow and, the next several years, okay, are going to be spent on what they're spending for today. And so a lot of these blue states, while they may be receiving less in federal funding, they're actually running deficits. They're doing the whole deficit spending idea. And so if you were to get rid of the red states and cut them off, they wouldn't be receiving some of their monies either, because they would have to get, eventually, they would have to get a bailout when it comes to their own deficit spending. So it's not as though the red states are necessarily funding the blue states, or the blue states are necessarily funding the red states. We actually are kind of in this together. And unfortunately, this whole idea of the national divorce, even just in this one aspect, would be really, really difficult. The other thing that a lot of people don't seem to understand or forget, let's say, is the fact that a lot of those red states that they want to cut off supply the food to all of the blue states. And the blue states are the demand for the red states. So there's always going to be a give and take. There's always going to be each one is beneficial. We're mutually beneficial to each other. And especially when you're dealing with things like rural versus urban. I don't see a lot of people who go through and, are like growing their own gardens in urban environments. In fact, when you look at places like, New York, Colorado, I'm sorry, not Colorado, Chicago. I was thinking Chicago. New York, Chicago, LA. There's not a lot of space there with all of the high-rise buildings and the large apartment complexes to grow your own food on a regular basis. And so you become dependent upon other people pushing in to get this taken care of. Okay. And so this whole idea of a national divorce, I mean, honestly, I think it's just, it's a little far-fetched. Plus, we also have, don't forget, all of our nuclear capability and all of our military capability. And you have all of these things like, if we split the country in two, like, let's just say we said, you know what, we're just going to cut right down the center and everybody on the left side is going to be blue and everybody on the right side is going to be red, or vice versa. And now all of a sudden you have a problem. What if China were to attack one or the other? You got a big problem. So this whole concept of a national divorce, I think, is far-fetched. And MTG, honestly, on Twitter has been taking a lot of grief because of it. But the left, of course, is framing it as though she is absolutely nuts. Dan Bongino actually, he played a video of her. If you haven't seen his podcast from today, discussing it, I think, or even yesterday where he was talking about, the divorce. The thing about it is that you need to understand that we are in a huge symbiotic relationship. Now, I personally, I think that this is going to break down again. If you want to talk civil war, if you want to talk, divorce and everything, this is breaking down to an urban versus rural scenario. And I think the urban side is going to have a lot more problems than what they think they have. It's either going to be that, or it could end up being a race war the way things are going. I'd hate for war to happen regardless. And to be completely honest, I actually think China is going to be causing some trouble here in the next year anyway, but I digress. That will be another program. But anyway, the point is, though, that the whole idea that the blue states are funding the red states or the red states are funding the blue states, the entire thing is bunk. It just is. It all depends on which metric that you use and how that metric is actually how that metric is actually going to be utilized. Like I've said multiple times, you can take statistics and turn them into whatever you want. There really isn't any way that you can't manipulate numbers and turn them into show which direction, or what you want them to show. It's just a matter of whether or not you go through and enough metrics that you take and manipulate show up in the proper space. Okay. All right. So last thing I want to do, I just noticed this. Going to give a real quick shout out here to the Outlaw Dogs and her Delaware Valley Water Moccasin swim team. They did their championships and they won second place overall. So that was an incredible season for them. Incredible season. Congratulations to them. And, yeah, so hopefully next season will be even better and they'll be hopefully a lot faster. I don't know if if Outlaw Dogs has a young team or an older team, because obviously kids, the seniors graduating and things like that can make a change on the effect. But anyway, all right. That is my final Whiskey Musings thought of the evening. Do me a favor. If you enjoy this program, head on over to Rumble. If you haven't done so already, sign up for an account and then find the Whiskey Musings broadcast and subscribe, or they call it a follow. Everything in this business is about following. Okay. Every single thing. So I am on a mission to try and hit 10,000 subscribers on Rumble by the end of 2023. It's a huge task and I'm running way behind. So anything you guys can do would be absolutely wonderful. If you've already subscribed and everything, do me a favor, help me out. Spread the word about the Whiskey Musings broadcast and let's try and get, more people to come on over. For those of you who are on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter who are watching, I'll still transmit there as long as I can, but I would really appreciate the follows over on Rumble because that's the metric that I'm using for watching, for all of that. So, so do me a favor, subscribe, hit the follow button, whatever. And if you want to go on the audio portion of the program, you can catch me on Spotify, Google, and I'm trying to think. I think that, and there's some other podcasts for the audio portion of the program. All right. Good night, everybody. And we will see you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast. Thank you all for joining and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night, everybody.